She held her purse close to her lap, fingers clenched over the fabric like it was the last thing tying her to dignity. Her knees ached from sitting on the cold metal bench for over an hour, and the chill from the concrete beneath her feet had already climbed up her spine. Still, she didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the end of the platform, waiting for a glimpse of the black SUV she knew wasn't coming. Sandra had never been left behind before. Not like this. That morning, her daughter-in-law Lindsay had picked her up just before sunrise. It was supposed to be a family trip, Lindsay's idea. "Let's take Mom along. It's been a while since she's seen the kids relaxed," she'd told Thomas, Sandra's son. Lindsay had sounded so convincing when she explained the plan. They would all go upstate to the lake house Lindsay's. Parents had rented. It would be a weekend of family meals, board games, fishing with the grandkids. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. Sandra had even packed snacks for the road. She'd made egg salad sandwiches, placed them in a cooler, and brought extra blankets for the kids in case they got cold. She wasn't asked to, but that's what she did. It's what she always did. She was the kind of mother who never arrived empty-handed. During the drive to the train station, Lindsay had been unusually quiet. She kept her sunglasses on, even, though the sun had barely risen. Thomas wasn't there. He'd gone ahead to help with the bags, Lindsay said. Her tone was flat. Sandra didn't ask questions. She'd learned over the past few years that silence was safer. Lindsay was always just polite enough to avoid conflict, but cold enough to remind Sandra she didn't belong. Still, she had convinced herself this weekend would be different. Maybe time together would soften things. When they pulled into the station, Lindsay parked near the drop-off zone and turned off the engine. "This is your stop," she said, not looking at her. Sandra blinked. "Sorry?" Lindsay reached into the back seat and grabbed Sandra's tote bag. "There was a change of plans. The rest of us are meeting at the other station, but it'll be easier for you to catch the train from here. There's no parking upstate, and you said you didn't want to drive, remember?" Sandra nodded slowly, even though she didn't remember saying that. "Is Thomas meeting me here?" "No," Lindsay said, her voice sharp. "He's with the kids already. I need to head back before traffic gets worse. The train should be here in 20 minutes. You'll be fine." She got out and opened the passenger door. Sandra hesitated. I didn't bring my wallet." "You don't need it," Lindsay said, setting the tote bag next to her on the bench. "The ticket's in your bag. Don't worry." Sandra stepped out, unsure of what else to say. She barely had time to register the cold before Lindsay had gotten back in the SUV and driven off. No wave, no goodbye. Just the taillights disappearing into the morning fog. Sandra waited until the SUV was gone before opening the tote bag. There was no ticket, no wallet, just the egg salad sandwiches she had made, her reading glasses, and a neatly folded cardigan. No phone, either. She had left it charging on the kitchen counter, assuming she wouldn't need it. That was 2 hours ago she had asked the ticket counter inside if her name was in the system. It wasn't. The man behind the glass told her the next train north wasn't for another 4 hours. She couldn't even buy a ticket. She had no cash, no cards, and no ID. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe there really had been a mix-up. Maybe Lindsay thought Thomas had handled the ticket. Maybe she'd be back. But the more time passed, the less that explanation made sense. Sandra didn't cry. She just sat, hands clenched, jaw locked. She could still see the soft blanket she'd tucked into the back seat for her granddaughter. She'd bought it herself last Christmas, lavender with little white stars, because Mia said it made her feel safe. But Mia wasn't here. She glanced at the tote bag again. She didn't open it. The sandwiches would be warm by now. By the time a cleaning crew passed by the platform, one of them asked her if she was waiting for someone. She nodded, but didn't speak. She couldn't speak. At 10:47 a.m., she stood up and walked outside. She didn't know exactly how she'd get back home, but she knew she couldn't sit there any longer. She shuffled toward the main road, her knees stiff, and flagged down a cab with the last of her strength. "I don't have any money," she told the driver, voice steady, "but if you take me home, I'll pay you there." The driver, a young man in his 20s, looked at her, then nodded. "Okay, ma'am." During the drive, she stared out the window. It was a long ride back. The silence in the car was thick, but it gave her time to think. She wasn't humiliated, not anymore. She was calculating, processing. The anger didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, settling into her chest with each passing mile. By the time they turned onto her street, her mind was already in motion. She asked the driver to wait while she went inside. She returned 5 minutes later with a crisp $100 bill and a small envelope. She handed him the cash. "And for you," she said, giving him the envelope. Inside was an extra $50 and a thank you note she had scribbled quickly. He tried to refuse it, but she insisted. When he left, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it. She didn't cry. She walked to the guest room, opened the top drawer of the nightstand, and pulled out a folder she hadn't touched in over a year. It contained documents her late husband had signed, a portfolio of investments, a list of offshore accounts, and a detailed breakdown of the small holding company she technically still owned 51% of. A company that, coincidentally, funded the luxury real estate development where Lindsay worked as a project director. They didn't know that part. They knew Sandra had worked as a receptionist at a hospital for 30 years. They knew she lived modestly. They assumed the old lady who wore the same winter coat for 10 years and brought homemade cookies to every gathering was just that, an aging mother who needed them. They never asked what happened to the life insurance from her husband. They never asked who managed the accounts he left behind. They never asked who signed the checks that kept Lindsay's public success afloat. They were about to find out. Sandra placed the folder on the kitchen table and went to make herself a cup of tea. She sat quietly, sipping it, staring at the documents. Her hands didn't tremble, not even once. What she had lost today wasn't respect. It was illusion, and in return, she had found something else: resolve. The next morning, Sandra woke up at 6:30, just like she always did. She boiled water, made black coffee, and sat by the window. The sun was still low, casting light across the street. Her street was quiet, mostly retirees and young couples with early work schedules. Sandra liked that about her neighborhood. It didn't ask much of her. Her body felt sore from the hours sitting at the train station, but she didn't complain, not even to herself. She had bigger things to focus on. She walked back into the kitchen and stared at the folder sitting on the table, the one she had taken from the guest room the day before. The papers were old, but everything inside was organized. She opened the folder again and reviewed every page. It had been a long time since she'd looked through it with intention. Her late husband, Robert, had left her with a surprising level of control over their financial assets. Back then, she hadn't wanted to deal with any of it. Her son, Thomas, had offered to take care of the paperwork, but Sandra said no. She remembered Robert's words before he passed. Don't hand over control just to be polite. The holding company listed in the documents was still active. She hadn't thought about it in years, assuming it just sat there generating passive income from a few investments. She had never paid much attention to its clients. Robert had managed all of that. But now it seemed important. She opened her laptop, logged into the company dashboard, and pulled up the list of active contracts. And there it was. Lindsay's company. Northbridge Urban Concepts, Sandra read quietly, narrowing her eyes. Lindsay's company had signed a 5-year deal with the holding firm, locking in capital for their luxury redevelopment project downtown. The fund, Under Sandra's control was one of the key financial backers, set to provide quarterly injections of cash. She clicked through the records. Another installment was due in 2 weeks. They had no idea. Sandra sat back in her chair. A strange calm settled over her. She wasn't angry in the explosive way most people would expect. She didn't want to scream or throw things. She just wanted control of her own story again. That's what had been stolen from her. For years, she'd said yes to every invitation, helped with school pickups, made extra food for holidays, bought gifts when she wasn't asked to, paid for things in secret. All to make sure her son and his family had an easier life. She never asked for credit. She never needed it. But yesterday, sitting on that bench alone, abandoned like she didn't matter, something broke. It was time to act. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in over a year. "Carla Rothman," the woman answered. "Carla, it's Sandra Whitman," she said, keeping her tone steady. "Oh, Sandra. Wow, it's been a long time. How are you? I need to review and restructure my asset allocations in the holding company, and I want a full report on Northbridge Urban Concepts' dependency on our funding." There was a pause on the line. Carla had been Robert's legal counsel for years. After his death, Sandra had retained her to manage the paperwork, but they hadn't had real contact in months. "Of course," Carla said quickly. "Would you like to meet in person?" "Yes. Today. At your office." Sandra hung up, stood up from the table, and went to get dressed. By 10:15, she was in a car heading across town to Carla's office. The city looked different than it did from her side of town. Taller buildings, polished storefronts, newer cars. She hadn't come down here often in recent years, and definitely not alone. She hadn't needed to. Carla greeted her in the lobby and brought her up to the conference room. Sandra sat down at the long table and placed the folder in front of her. "I want to make something clear before we start," Sandra said. No one is to know that I'm re-examining these accounts. Not my son, not his wife, not anyone." Carla nodded. "Understood." They went through the documents together. Carla pulled up the digital files, reviewed the contracts, and then paused. "Northbridge," she said, pointing at the screen. "They've tied nearly 60% of their current project funding to your holding. The next payment is due on the 12th. "And if it's delayed?" Sandra asked. Carla looked at her. "It puts the entire project at risk. They've over-leveraged. Delaying even 1/4 of funding would force them to halt construction. Possibly default on a few partner contracts." Sandra didn't blink. "Good. I want that payment held for review. I also want you to prepare a statement saying the firm is entering a temporary audit period. Routine, standard language." "Are you sure?" Carla asked, eyes narrowing slightly. "This could blow back on your daughter-in-law." "I'm counting on it," Sandra replied. Carla didn't ask more after that. By the time Sandra left the office, it was nearly lunchtime. She walked into a nearby diner and ordered a grilled cheese with tomato soup. She sat at the window, eating slowly, watching people pass by. She wasn't used to being downtown alone, but she felt fine. Better than fine. She felt capable. When she got home, there was a message on her landline. "Thomas. Hey, Mom. Lindsay said you didn't make it to the lake house. We tried calling, but your phone went to voicemail. Just checking in, I guess. Hope everything's okay." He didn't sound concerned. He sounded annoyed, like he was obligated to call. Sandra didn't return the call. That evening, she pulled out an old shoebox from her bedroom closet. It was filled with paper photos, many of them faded. Pictures of Thomas as a boy, of Robert working in the garden, of birthday parties, and school recitals. But as she flipped through them, her fingers froze on one particular photo. It was a picture of her and Lindsay, from about 10 years ago. Lindsay was holding baby Mia, and Sandra had her hand on Lindsay's shoulder, smiling. Lindsay wasn't smiling. She looked tense even then. Sandra stared at the photo for a long time, then placed it face down on the table. Around 9 p.m., she sat at her desk and opened her laptop again. This time, she pulled up her will. It hadn't been updated in over 5 years. She began typing. Sandra didn't update her will all at once. She started slowly, item by item, reading through each clause with care. The house was still in her name. The car. The small retirement property she and Robert had bought out in Sedona, which her family never asked about because they assumed it had been sold long ago. Most of the assets were untouched since Robert's passing. But now she looked at everything with new eyes. She sat at the desk typing methodically. She removed Thomas as executor. She removed Lindsay's name entirely. She reassigned control to Carla's legal office. Then she updated the primary beneficiaries. Not family, institutions, quiet ones, places that had helped her after Robert passed. A community library, a senior wellness program, a shelter for women over 60 who had been displaced by family or caretakers. The change wasn't just about revenge. It was about correcting years of imbalance. She didn't want her money to go to people who saw her as disposable. After she finished, she saved the changes and emailed Carla for formal notarization. The next day, she followed her usual morning routine. Coffee, breakfast, walk around the sea, block. The air was crisp, early fall. Neighbors waved. Sandra nodded back. She liked her neighborhood because no one asked questions. They weren't close, but they were kind. That was enough. When she got back to the house, she checked her email. Carla had responded. The documents were prepared. They'd meet Friday to finalize everything. At 10:43 a.m., her home phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but answered. Hello? Hi, this is Megan from Northbridge Urban Concepts. I'm calling on behalf of Lindsay Whitman's office. She asked me to follow up on the audit delay. Sandra stayed quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. I'm not sure why you're calling me directly. Oh, sorry, ma'am. Lindsay just mentioned that you're part of the capital management group, and we had a question about a paused payment. She thought it might have been a clerical error. It wasn't an error, Sandra said. Oh, okay. Should I let her know someone from the finance team will be in touch? You can tell her that everything is proceeding according to standard. Review protocol. That's all I can say right now. Megan thanked her and hung up. That was the first sign that Lindsay was beginning to notice. 3 hours later, Thomas called again. Sandra let it go to voicemail. She checked the message once it came through. Mom, hey. I just talked to Lindsay. She said something came up at work and that you might be involved. I'm not sure what's going on, but if there's something wrong, we should talk. Call me, okay? Sandra didn't call back. That night, she made soup. She listened to the news. She took out a puzzle she hadn't touched in months and worked on the edges. She wasn't pretending nothing had happened. She just didn't feel the need to respond to people who only reached out when they needed something. The next morning, she got a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She peered through the side window and saw Thomas standing on the porch, shifting from foot to foot. Alone. Sandra opened the door slowly. Didn't expect a visit. Can I come in? She stepped aside without a word. Thomas looked uncomfortable. He scanned the room like it had changed since the last time he'd been there, though nothing had. He sat on the couch. Sandra remained standing. Lindsay told me some payments from your end didn't go through, he began. And now her office is going into some kind of emergency review. She's really stressed. Sandra nodded once. I'm sure she is. Are you involved in that? He asked. Yes. He looked surprised she admitted it so directly. I'm not trying to accuse you, he said quickly. It's just, I didn't even know you had anything to do with her work. You never asked, Sandra replied. Thomas looked down. Okay, that's fair. But why now? I mean, is this because of what happened at the station? Sandra sat down slowly. She looked him in the eye. You knew I had no ticket, no wallet, no phone. You knew. He didn't respond. Lindsay told me it was just easier that way, he finally said. Less complicated. She said you'd be more comfortable traveling alone and meeting us later. You agreed to that? I didn't think it was a big deal, he said. We've all been stressed. The kids, the business, everything's been tight. I didn't know you'd take it that way. Sandra's voice didn't rise. You left me at a train station, alone, without money, without contact. I'm your mother. You didn't check. You didn't call. Not until Lindsay's office got nervous about money. He rubbed his hands together. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, she said, her voice even. You just never saw it in proportion to begin with. He leaned back. So, what now? You're cutting us off? I'm not cutting anyone off. I'm just reassessing where I place my trust. He stared at her, trying to read her expression. Is there anything I can do to fix this? Sandra paused. You can leave. Mom, she stood up. Thomas stared at her, then slowly stood as well. Okay, he said. Okay. He left without another word. She locked the door behind him. That evening, she received a text from Lindsay. We need to talk. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. Sandra didn't reply. The next day, Carla sent over the final paperwork. Sandra signed it and scanned it back. Every asset restructured. Every account secured. The audit language had been finalized. The Northbridge payment was officially frozen. Later that week, Sandra went to the pharmacy. While waiting for her prescription, she ran into Mary Ann, a woman she hadn't seen in nearly a year. They spoke briefly, about nothing important. But as Sandra was leaving, Mary Ann stopped her. By the way, she said, lowering her voice, I heard your daughter-in-law is having some legal trouble at work. Something about missing funds. That's rough. Sandra gave a polite smile. I wouldn't know much about it. She walked out to her car and drove home, her prescription in the passenger seat. She didn't feel smug. She didn't feel triumphant. What she felt was control. The kind she hadn't had in a long, long time. And this time, she wasn't giving it back. On Monday morning, Sandra was folding laundry when her landline rang. She almost didn't answer, but the number was local. She picked it up. Mrs. Whitman? A woman's voice asked. Yes. This is Janice from Northbridge Urban Concepts. I work in project operations. I'm calling because we've encountered a delay in the next round of funding tied to the East Point redevelopment. We were hoping to confirm whether this delay is due to a technical issue or an intentional freeze. Sandra didn't respond immediately. Mrs. Whitman? The woman repeated, her voice more cautious now. Sandra kept her tone neutral. I believe that question should be directed to the managing party of the fund. I'm not authorized to speak on financials by phone. Janice hesitated. Lindsay mentioned you might be willing to clarify personally. I'm not, Sandra said, and I won't be taking additional calls from your office. She hung. Up 5 minutes later, her cell phone rang. Lindsay. She didn't answer. Then came a text. Sandra, please. We need to meet. I don't know why you're doing this, but we can fix it. I'm free this afternoon. Sandra turned the phone face down on the table. At noon, she made herself a sandwich, sat on the back porch, and listened to the wind move. Through the trees. No one came by. No neighbors dropped in. No one texted again for the rest of the day. It was quiet, which was exactly how she liked it. By Tuesday, things were clearly escalating. Around 11 a.m., Thomas came by again. This time he didn't knock. He pounded. She saw him through the peephole, agitated, pacing, looking around like someone might be watching. She didn't open the door. Mom, he called out, please open the door. She stayed silent. He waited a full 5 minutes, then finally gave up. She watched him leave through the front window, When his car pulled away, she finally exhaled. That afternoon, Carla called. Sandra, just so you're aware, Lindsay's legal team sent a request for clarification about the freeze. They're pressing hard, but we've responded with standard audit language. Nothing outside policy. Let me know if anything changes, Sandra said. You sure you're okay? I'm fine. Carla paused. They're not going to stop easily. I know. On Wednesday morning, Sandra received a handwritten envelope in the mailbox. No return address, just her name in tight cursive on the front. She opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a letter from Lindsay. Sandra, I don't know what happened between us. Maybe you felt pushed out. Maybe we didn't make enough space for you. But freezing the payments affects more than just me. It affects the entire team. The city project is at risk. Hundreds of hours of work, reputations, opportunities. I wish we could have talked before this happened. If there's any chance you'd be willing to sit down with me and Thomas, we'd appreciate it. You're still part of this family, no matter what. Please, let's not turn this into something bigger. Sandra folded the letter and placed it in the trash without reading it again. She sat in the living room that afternoon, reading a book she'd started months ago but never finished. Around 4 p.m., her phone rang again. This time, it was her granddaughter, Mia. Sandra hesitated. She hadn't expected that. She answered. Hi, Grandma. Mia's voice came through softly. Hi, sweetie. Are you okay? I am. I just wanted to hear your voice. Dad and Mom are really mad right now. They're yelling a lot. Sandra kept her tone calm. You didn't do anything wrong. I know. I just miss you. I miss you too. There was a long pause. Are you still coming to my recital next month? Mia asked. Sandra closed her eyes briefly. I'd like to, if your mom and dad are okay with that. They don't have to be. I want you there. I'll do my best, Sandra said. When the call ended, she sat for a moment longer. Then she got up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside were old photos of Mia, drawings from preschool, and a small music program from the last recital she attended. She looked through them slowly, her fingers steady. At 5:12 p.m., her phone rang again. Lindsay. This time, Sandra answered. Sandra, Lindsay said quickly. Thank you for picking up. I've been trying to reach you for days. I know. I just want to talk. I think this got out of hand. We should be able to fix this. Fix what? Well, Lindsay paused, searching for the right words. We're under pressure now. The city is asking questions. Some of our investors are nervous. This isn't just affecting me, you understand? I understand perfectly. Then why are you doing this? Sandra didn't respond right away. She stood up from the chair and walked slowly to the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. You left me at a train station, Lindsay. No wallet, no phone, no explanation. You made sure there was no way for me to call you. You went on your trip and celebrated while I sat on a bench for hours. Lindsay was silent. And you didn't call to check if I got home. You didn't follow up the next day. You didn't even ask Thomas to call until you started having work issues. Sandra? No. Listen to me now. You want to talk about consequences, Lindsay? You created them. Don't do this, Lindsay said quietly. Please, I can't fix this if you don't give me a chance. I gave you years of chances. I gave you dinners, holidays, childcare, money. I gave you time. What I didn't give you was respect, because you never earned it. And now I'm taking back what I should have never handed over. So what now? Lindsay asked, her voice tighter. You're cutting us off? Destroying everything? I'm not destroying anything. I'm letting things fall on their own. Sandra hung up. The next morning, she received an email from Carla. Northbridge formally requested early termination of the audit. We declined. They're escalating. Sandra replied with a short message. Stay the course. No changes. By Friday, rumors were spreading. One of Sandra's neighbors, a retired realtor named Helen, stopped her on the sidewalk. I heard your daughter-in-law might be in trouble, Helen said. Sandra just nodded. People should be more careful about what they rely on. Helen smiled. They underestimated you, didn't they? Sandra didn't answer. She continued walking, hands in her coat pockets, the morning air cool and still. By the following Tuesday, Sandra's voicemail was full. Messages from Thomas, from Lindsay's office, from Lindsay herself. Most sounded composed on the surface, but Sandra could tell the tone had shifted. They weren't trying to reason anymore. They were trying to salvage what was left. At 8:17 that morning, Sandra opened the front door to find a bouquet of white lilies on her porch. No card. She brought them inside, set them on the kitchen counter, and left them there untouched. Later that day, a knock came at her door. It was Thomas. He looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes puffy like he hadn't slept properly in days. He didn't wait for her to invite him in, just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets. I don't know where else to go, he said. Sandra didn't move. We're in trouble, Mom, he said. Lindsay's firm is falling apart. She's got reporters calling. She's been pulled from 3 boards already. The city might sue for breach of contract if the East Point development collapses. She's not sleeping. We can't keep up with payroll next month. Sandra crossed her arms. And? Thomas's jaw clenched. You made your point. All right? You've punished us. So what now? I didn't punish anyone, Sandra said. I simply stopped financing behavior I no longer support. Do you think I meant to hurt you? He said suddenly. Do you think I wanted this to happen? Sandra didn't answer. Thomas took a deep breath and sat on the bench near the garden. He looked around like he hadn't really seen her backyard before. When Dad died, I didn't know how to help you. You just shut down. Lindsay said we should give you space. You gave me silence, Thomas, she said. Not space. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. You're right. They sat in silence for a while. Then Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Can you reconsider the freeze? Even just partially? If the next payment doesn't come through, the entire firm collapses. Lindsay's worked so hard to build it. She built it on someone else's money, Sandra said. And someone else's silence. He looked up at her. I didn't mind. Helping you, she continued. What I minded was being erased while doing it. Lindsay didn't just use me. She made sure the kids saw me as a burden, and you let that happen. Thomas looked down again. I know, he said. I wasn't brave. I avoided the fights. I thought it was easier that way. Easier for you, she said. He didn't defend himself. He just nodded again, slower this time. Then he stood. I don't know what happens next, he said. But if you decide to help, we'll be grateful. And if not, I guess we deserve that too. He walked out quietly, without asking for a hug or a goodbye. Sandra closed the door behind him and didn't look out the window to watch him leave. That evening, Mia called again. Are you okay, Grandma? I'm fine, Sandra said. Mom's been crying a lot, Mia whispered. She's scared. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Do you still have that blanket I gave you last Christmas? The purple one with stars? Yeah. Keep it close. It's going to be all right. The next morning, Sandra met with Carla in person. They sat in Carla's office, reviewing financial documents line by line. After the audit began, 3 other investors had approached Carla privately about withdrawing from Northbridge. Sandra hadn't asked them to. Once they saw what was happening, they made the choice themselves. They're bleeding, Carla said. Even if you release the funds now, the brand damage is done. I'm not releasing anything, Sandra said. I'm moving on. What about Thomas and the grandkids? They're not the ones who built this mess, but I can't protect them from the consequences either. Carla nodded. I'll finalize the transfer paperwork this week. Sandra stood, gathered her purse, and prepared to leave. As she reached the door, Carla said, You know, I've had other clients go through family betrayals. Most never do anything about it. They just complain or distance themselves. You actually made it count. I didn't set out to ruin anyone, Sandra said. They did that on their own. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it. That afternoon, another envelope arrived at her door. This time a typed letter, clearly prepared by someone on Lindsay's PR team. Apologetic, but distant. No acknowledgement of what had happened personally, only an offer to restore professional harmony and rebuild mutual benefit. Sandra didn't read past the first paragraph. She shredded it. On Saturday morning, Sandra woke up early and took out a fresh notebook from her closet. She sat at the dining table and started listing things she wanted to do. None of them involved Thomas or Lindsay. It wasn't about revenge now. It was about recentering her own life. She wrote, Visit the senior center in Glenview. Volunteer at the animal shelter twice a week. Take a weekend trip to Sedona alone. Update the emergency contact form. At the clinic, remove Thomas. Add Mia to the college trust account, separate trustee. She stopped at that last one. She didn't know if Mia would ever understand all of this. Maybe one day she'd ask. Or maybe she'd just feel the difference, even without the full story. Sandra folded the list and placed it in her planner. Then she made herself lunch and sat on the back porch, the same one where she used to babysit the kids while Lindsay took calls inside. Now, there were no calls, just silence, the kind she chose for herself. Sandra arrived at Carla's office on Wednesday afternoon to finalize the transfer of the remaining shares in the holding company. She walked in wearing her beige coat and carried a small leather folder. Her steps were steady, and her voice was firm. There were no questions left to ask. She had reviewed everything twice the night before. Carla greeted her in the hallway. It's all ready, she said. We just need your signature. Sandra nodded and followed her into the conference room. The table was covered with neatly stacked documents. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper rustling as Carla passed each page to her, explaining what it represented. Asset redirection. Beneficiary updates. Legal confirmation of withdrawal from Northbridge Project Capital. A clean and legal severing of financial ties. Sandra signed every line without hesitation. It took less than 30 minutes. When they finished, Carla leaned back. That's it. You're officially out. They won't be able to trace a cent back to you now. Sandra took a moment before responding. Good. Carla closed the file and asked, Do you want me to notify them officially? No, Sandra replied. Let them find out the way they've always treated me, by hearing it from someone else. Later that evening, Sandra made a quiet dinner and sat alone at the kitchen table. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. She poured herself a cup of tea and turned on the local news. Just before the half-hour mark, a segment appeared about delays in the East Point redevelopment project. The news anchor mentioned financial instability, unnamed investors withdrawing, and new questions about Northbridge's future. Lindsay wasn't mentioned by name, but the implication was clear. Sandra muted the television and finished her tea. At 8:40 p.m., there was another knock at the door. She opened it to find Lindsay on the porch. Her hair was pulled back, but messy. No makeup. She looked thinner, like she hadn't eaten or slept properly in days. Please, Lindsay said. Can we talk? Sandra stepped aside, allowing her in. Lindsay walked in slowly, scanning the living room like it was unfamiliar. She didn't sit until Sandra motioned toward the chair across from her. I don't know what to say, Lindsay started. Everything's falling apart. The project is frozen. 2 investors pulled out this week. The city sent us a warning letter. Sandra said nothing. I made mistakes, Lindsay admitted. I didn't treat you right. I didn't appreciate what you did for us. I don't even think I understood how much you were doing." "No," Sandra said. "You understood. You just didn't care." Lindsay's mouth opened, then closed again. "I tried to make things easier," Lindsay said, quietly. "You were always around. You had opinions. You took up space." Sandra looked at her directly. "It was my space, my house, my time, my money. But that didn't matter to you, as long as I stayed quiet." Lindsay leaned forward. "What do you want me to say?" "Nothing," Sandra said. "This isn't about words. It's about what you did, what you allowed. You made sure my role in this family was small and quiet, then got upset when I stopped playing it." Lindsay swallowed hard. "I came here because we're out of options. We're 2 weeks from defaulting on the vendor contracts. And the audit. Language scared off the new partners. If you end the freeze, I can fix the rest." Sandra shook her head. "I'm not rescuing you." "Even for Thomas?" Lindsay asked. Sandra looked down at her hands, then back up. "Thomas made his choice. He didn't defend me when it mattered. Now he's living with the consequences of who he married and what he allowed." There was silence between them. Finally, Lindsay said, "So that's it?" "Yes." Sandra stood up. Lindsay hesitated, then stood as well. Before leaving, Lindsay turned. "You could have told us you had money, that you had power. You never asked. And if I had told you, would it have changed how you treated me? Or just how you used me?" Lindsay didn't answer. Sandra opened the door and waited. Without another word, Lindsay stepped out and walked to her car. Sandra closed the door and locked it. The next morning, Sandra drove to Glenview Senior Center and dropped off a donation envelope. Then she met with the director to discuss volunteering twice a week for their lunch service. They gave her a visitor badge and showed her around the building. It was simple, clean, full of women who, like her, had once been dismissed quietly in their own homes. At lunch, she served soup, helped 2 women carry trays, and answered questions about crossword puzzles. It was the most peaceful day she'd had in years. By the end of the week, she received a call from Mia's school. Mia had listed her as an emergency contact for a school recital. The administrator asked if Sandra would be able to attend since no one had responded to their emails. Sandra confirmed she'd be there. On the day of the recital, Sandra sat in the second row, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. When Mia walked onto the stage and saw her, her eyes lit up. She waved once, subtly. Sandra nodded back. After the performance, Mia ran over and hugged her tight. "You came. I told you I would," Sandra said. Thomas stood further back in the auditorium, alone. He saw Sandra, gave a small wave. She returned it politely, then turned back to Mia. That night, Sandra returned home, changed into her pajamas, and sat in bed with a book. Her phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. "Thank you for being there for her. I know we don't deserve it." She stared at the screen for a while before turning it off. She didn't reply. The house was quiet, but for once, that quiet belonged to her.